We resume with a look at our tertiary sector. This sector is also known as the service sector. And within the tertiary sector, we find a lot of the businesses like those that are found on your screen right now. The tertiary sector reflects retail, grocery stores, restaurants, carryouts, coffee shops, resorts, so hospitality and tourism. The tertiary sector is where we start to find specialization, where people move into roles where they specialize. So again, think about the way in which we work and the way in which we consume today. We work in very narrow fields. We don't grow our own food. We don't make our own clothes. We purchase those. So we work in one field. We specialize, which allows us to become more efficient, which allows us to grow our income. In a basic sector activity, it allows us to grow our revenue streams into a local area that'll increase consumer demand. So at the tertiary sector, we find semi to higher skilled labor. We find a lot of jobs like those on the screen right now: retail, um, tourism, transportation. We find the employees that might be working with a high school degree or a college degree. We're not looking quite at the decision makers at this point. We're looking at those different industries that serve a mass consumption society. So many of you today may be working in these fields. A lot of part-time work is found in the tertiary sector, though full-time jobs are also included. The quaternary sector is known as our knowledge sector. And when we talk about services as a way of distinguishing work between primary and secondary, between raw materials and manufacturing, when we talk about the service sector jobs and we split them between tertiary and quaternary, quaternary is a higher level. This is where decision making and research is found. So when we think about those in the quaternary level, we're looking at intellectual activities. We're talking about our most highly educated, our most talented workforce members, members that work in high-tech and information-based occupations, the people that build our designs for our smartphones, right, that enable us to learn in an online environment. These high-skilled, high-paying jobs, here I have a global workforce where we pool talent from around the world. These are the types of occupations that fall into the quaternary sector: research and design, information technology, investment decisions, health and pharmaceutical. Think about going into your local bank. A bank teller would fall into the tertiary sector, whereas somebody putting together an investment portfolio for you would fall into the quaternary sector. When we look at something like Apple, the iPhone, the individual that sells the iPhone in the Apple store, that would be somebody who falls into the tertiary sector. The behind the scenes research and design, how do we make our next release cutting edge? How do we create these improvements? That's done in the quaternary sector. Many of you today are pursuing degrees that'll land you in the quaternary sector. Maybe not right off the bat at graduation, but long term, this is where many of you will end up. So when we look at our sectors, primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary, we see a rapid drop over the 20th century and 21st century in primary. Over the last 50 years, we've seen a decline in secondary. Over the last 50 years, we've seen a rapid increase in tertiary. And in the 21st century, we're seeing a rise in quaternary as well. So again, when we break down our economy, when we look at primary as raw materials, secondary as manufacturing, tertiary and quaternary falling into the service sectors, and what separates tertiary from quaternary is that level of skill, that level of education, that level of influence and decision making. So practice these different sectors. Think about the way in which non-basic and basic fall into each of these sectors. Our quaternary sector will certainly be a sector of basic activities that bring revenue into an economy, into a community, whereas our tertiary fill a lot of those non-basic jobs like your Rite Aid, like your retail, like your grocery stores, like your carryouts, like your cafes. So again, the more familiar you are talking through these examples and applying that economic base model, the more separation you'll see among the sectors. In part two, we're going to examine that why, where question and look at globalization and economic production. Where do economic activities take place? And cost minimizing is the driving force. Any business owner, anybody applying rational economic thought is going to look to minimize costs. And cost minimization creates a very well-defined spatial pattern. And we find that with our division of labor. So when we talk about globalization and economic production, we're picking up on that idea of deindustrialization, where low-cost labor becomes very attractive. Low-cost labor usually looks at semi-skilled production. So where can we send our assembly lines, our factories? Where can we offshore these parts of our business to pursue low-cost labor? And there are a number of examples. One of them close to home sits right over the border in Mexico. These, what are known as borderplexes, cities that cross the US-Mexico border, are home to many maquiladoras. Maquiladoras are factories or assembly plants located on the Mexican side of the border. Labor in Mexico is significantly less costly than that what we would find in the United States. Whereas a manufacturing job in the United States probably costs you about $20 an hour for semi-skilled production, you might be able to hire somebody in a maquiladora for 20% of that cost per day. So the cost savings are significant. It's much cheaper to send our inputs across the border, have them assembled in Mexico, and then shipped back into the United States. NAFTA, which was agreed upon in 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, facilitated this setup by reducing tariffs and barriers to send inputs and finished goods back and forth across the border. More recently, we have the USMCA that also supports this type of free trade. What we find are agglomerations, and agglomerations just mean clusters. So these maquiladoras, there's not just one or two of them. What we find is that it benefits both Mexico and the United States. So we find clusters of factories producing all different types of goods, from cars to electronic components to toys to clothing. And Mexico is able to create this cluster of workers on one side that allows those workers to increase their income, provides jobs. And then in the United States consumer society is able to benefit from lower costs and the availability, the supply of goods. In an upcoming chapter, we're going to look at a little deeper into the benefits on each side of this relationship. But as far as an economic benefit goes, both Mexico and the United States are benefiting economically from this arrangement. When we look at where to attract production, again, we look at low cost. And beyond Mexico, we see how countries in East Asia, what are known as newly industrialized countries or newly industrialized economies, are able to create additional incentives. So these countries, they have the labor force match. They have semi-skilled laborers that are working at the right price to attract production, to attract businesses to offshore their production into those countries. Many of these newly industrialized countries, they'll start out with low value added, meaning that they'll start out with low cost production like garments. So you might open up facilities that create athletic wear for Under Armour or Nike or Adidas. And later on, they'll build these forward and backward linkages to increase consumer demand, increase affluence, and also diversify their economy. So thinking back to a similar perspective of the staple theory, you're able to start low and build your manufacturing sector um, through early gains in low value added, later on high value added. And we see some of the countries in this chart from the Greiner text that shows us how countries like Hong Kong have um, nearly halved their their exports in apparel. So in 1980, Hong Kong was about a quarter of their total exports was apparel, clothing, low value added goods. Today, it's only well, in 2000 it was about 12%, and it's lower today. A country like South Korea, very similar. They got in early on low value added goods, garments and kids' toys. Today, they're doing more high tech production. So newly industrialized countries were able to create that labor force match, adopt low value added manufacturing early, and later on they would add high value added manufacturing. Think about the approach that Mexico is taking today. They are increasing from low value added that started in the 1990s, and they're following a similar trajectory to these newly industrialized countries that are focused in East Asia. Tax incentives are also very important, so that when a multinational corporation decides to open up production in a certain area, that they're going to benefit financially not just from the low cost labor, but also the removal of barriers and tariffs. So when we have a tariff, we're increasing the cost of the product, and that increase is ultimately paid by the consumer. So if a multinational corporation was producing in Hong Kong, but there were tariffs on the goods, then that would offset the low cost that was realized through low cost labor. So tax incentives are really important. Different countries have organized export processing zones and special economic zones. In China, there are a number of special economic zones where capitalism and free trade is allowed to progress, allowed to um, dominate trade and production in those areas. China as a whole is a communist country. It's a controlled economy. But in these certain areas, multinational corporations are allowed to take advantage of that labor match, are allowed to take advantage of lower cost production, and China will export from these areas without additional barriers and costs. So when we look at globalization and economic production, some of the consequences that evolve is a core periphery system. So if a country gets stuck in just providing for the more affluent consumer base, then there's not a lot of gains realized. And we're going to look at core periphery in an upcoming chapter. When we examine this relationship that's growing, right? When we look at the role, when we look at who's benefiting where, we see that this global system of production is important. It supports our mass consumption society. We're also seeing how, in that chart in the middle of your screen, a country like the United States is profiting the most, right? Where Japan, Taiwan, China are profiting a little bit, but not as much. So one of the things we'll look at in an upcoming chapter is the difference in development and who's gaining the most. While we could recognize right now, right here, that an economic benefit is diffused, that countries that weren't producing, that weren't realizing a manufacturing sector are today, and that wages are increasing, demand is increasing. What we're going to look at are some of the bigger picture issues with overall development that's not just economic. We're quantifying it, we're saying it's happening here. We'll look at other types of development, social development later on. So we'll wrap up this look at globalization and economic production, and in the next segment, we're going to talk about mass consumption economy and society, and reflect on what's happening at home and how we as consumers benefit and also drive continual change in our economy, in our society.